Welcome to Chapter 6, Patterns of Production. Our background music today is Scottish. Today we're going to be talking about mechanistic versus organismic societies. Prior to approximately 10,000 years ago, anthropologists believed that all humans lived in small hunting and gathering bands, referred to as hunting and gathering because their diet, their food supply, came from hunting activities, which provided the protein and were done primarily by males in the tribe, and gathering activities, which provided fruits, nuts, vegetables, roots, other forms of vegetation that were used for the primary bulk or calories in the diet. These were provided primarily by females, and therefore their contribution to the survival of the tribe was also important. Because both males and females contributed to the food supply, they were valued equally within the group. Men still were in charge, however. Within these hunting and gathering bands, there was relative equality in other ways as well. There was generally no permanent fixed leadership. One person might be the leader in a hunt, if, for example, he was a better hunter. Another person perhaps would be the leader in fishing activities or religious activities or treating wounds or medical activities, for example. Each one led depending upon their abilities in a particular area. Again, relative equality. There was relative equality in terms of possessions because nobody had very much, and everyone lived pretty much the same as everyone else. These, after all, were semi-nomadic groups. They had no pack animals. What they had was what they could carry, and therefore no one accumulated much in the way of possessions. There was also very little specialization within these groups. Every man could do what every other man could do. Every woman could do what every other woman could do. And therefore the man, woman, and their small nuclear family could exist independently from others in the tribe if they needed to for periods of time. In fact, most of these bands were fewer than 50 people and consisted primarily of relatives. The model used for understanding these hunting and gathering tribes is both from archaeological evidence as well as evidence that exists in hunting and gathering tribes that exist today. Anthropologists refer to these groups as mechanistic, meaning that they functioned independently. People could live without large groups of other people because they were their own specialists. Everyone could do what everyone else could do. They not only provided their own food, they built their own houses, provided their own clothing or shelter. They entertained themselves through body art, forms of music, dance, storytelling, speech, and other art forms that existed in the more practical arts we now refer to as crafts in the West, things like basket making, carving masks, etc. Therefore, because they could exist independently, they were not functioning as a single organism, but instead mechanistically. This contrasts greatly with what happened after 10,000 years ago when agriculture became the primary mode of producing food, the primary pattern of production. With agriculture, you could produce more food on the land than you could get simply by hunting and gathering, and therefore you needed fewer people to produce that food. Therefore, people became specialized in other tasks or other activities, and many of them began to live in small towns, ultimately cities and urban areas, engaging in those specialty tasks. The farms provided the food, the specialists provided the services, and the goods that were produced in those societies. Because people now had a fixed residence, they now could obtain and possess more goods. They didn't have to carry things around with them. So there also became inequality in terms of possessions. Land ownership was the primary form of inequality in terms of property, and leadership roles became fixed, primarily among the wealthy, the landowners, and the specialists who could provide rare services, politicians, lawyers, doctors, etc. In these societies, the role of women also became devalued because their activities, the things that they could do, no longer contributed greatly to the food supply. According to anthropologists, in an organismic society, people depend on each other to an elaborate extent. Most of you, for example, have no idea how to grow your own food, make your own clothes, build your own house. You're dependent on other people for those activities. And in that sense, society functions as a whole or as an organism. Unfortunately, within these organismic societies, you also have an escalation in problems. In hunting and gathering bands, when there was conflict, people could simply separate or move apart. They were semi-nomadic anyway and only had what they could carry with them. But now when people are tied to their possessions, and ownership of land is extremely important in terms of how wealthy you are, how politically active, and how powerful you are, people fight for land, people fight for possessions or wealth, and therefore war and conflict, particularly among those living in urban areas, became more prominent along with the onset of agriculture. One of the additional reasons for increased urbanization was that there was an escalation in population with the onset of agriculture. The onset of agriculture meant that children were now needed on the farm to work, and so the more kids you had, the wealthier you were because you had lots of free labor. For all of these reasons, in current society, we function as an organism, a single organism, where people are very dependent upon each other for not only their existence in terms of conflict and power and warfare, but also their survival in terms of the food supply and the other goods that we find necessary in order to live. We're an organismic society. Hunters and gatherers are primarily